She knew every corner of my life, every fear, every hope. But in that split second, stuck at a red light, I saw her, truly saw her for the first time. She was his, right there in broad daylight. The lies, the deceit, they weren't hidden in shadows. They were flaunted, as if I was too blind to see. But I saw everything. That moment shattered the world I thought was mine and left me standing in the wreckage of our broken vows. My wife knows me very well. She can often guess where I'll take her to dinner, even when I try to surprise her. She has a knack for sensing when I need a little extra attention. She knows everything about my life, from my school days to my worries and why I have them. I share everything with her because I trust her completely. She knows that I always eat lunch at 11:30 each day. I started taking an early lunch when I was the youngest employee in my office, and I just kept the habit. But sometimes, as life goes, things change. Today, my wife doesn't realize I'm having a longer lunch because the whole office is going to a farewell party for one of the senior managers. Bill Thornton, the director of our research and development branch, is retiring after 36 years, and everyone is gathering to celebrate him. Lyle, a young engineer in my team, is someone I enjoy working with. He's dedicated, creative, and very resourceful. When it came time for raises and bonuses, I was glad to recommend him. With his first big bonus, Lyle bought a large Chevy Suburban because he has one child and another on the way. He wanted a car that would fit his growing family. I thought it was bigger than necessary, but he was excited and wanted to show it off. Since I have more experience, I got to sit in the front seat while we drove to the convention center. "So, Ron, what do you think of my new ride?" Lyle asked. "That's me, Ron, also called Ronald Masters. I'm 29, healthy, and respected in my field of mechanical engineering. Recently, though, my job has shifted away from mechanics into management, which has kept me busy. I've even thought about taking night classes in management to handle my new responsibilities better." "It's great," I replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. Or is cool the right word these days? I can never keep up with the slang, I joked, and he laughed. "Do you really like it?" "Oh, absolutely," I said, turning to admire the spacious interior of his car. "Wow, Lyle," I said. "I think our first apartment was smaller than this." He chuckled, clearly happy with my response. As Lyle stopped at a red light, I realized how high we were sitting. Lyle's vehicle offered a fantastic view of the road ahead. Then, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. To my surprise, I saw my wife in her car next to us at the light. This wasn't an area she usually visited. It was far from her work, and she rarely went out during the day. I fumbled with the window controls to say hello, but it was taking too long. Just as I was about to open the door, I noticed a man was sitting next to her, and I felt a wave of unease. I froze. A tight knot formed in my stomach. I felt pale, and my hands were shaking on the door handle. I was overwhelmed. I couldn't think or move. All I could do was watch. I hoped my wife would push the man away, but she didn't seem bothered. Their closeness left me speechless. My vision narrowed, and I felt a heavy pressure on my chest. I couldn't breathe. The shock drained my strength, leaving me feeling empty. As I watched my wife lean back, looking relaxed, it dawned on me that this was familiar for her with this man. The look of happiness on her face shocked me. It was the same smile she used to show me when we were close. The light turned green, and I saw her playfully tap the man's arm. They seemed to prepare to drive away. I turned in my seat as Lyle drove away from the intersection, watching my wife's car make a turn back to her work. She didn't look up to see who might be watching from the big Suburban, likely unaware that I was just a short distance away. She didn't think I would be out during this time. When she got home that evening, she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. A couple of years ago, I would have received warm, loving kisses when I came home from work. Over time, those kisses had faded away. As I watched her walk up the stairs, I noticed something odd. "Sherry!" I called out. "What happened to your pantyhose? I know you wore a new pair this morning. Why aren't you wearing any now?" She paused before heading to our bedroom, taking her time to respond. "Oh, I got a snag in the right leg," she finally said. "It kept getting worse, so I just took them off." She smiled back at me, looking more intensely than usual, gauging my reaction. I nodded, trying to seem understanding. As she turned away, I caught a glimpse of relief on her face. I see, I replied, hoping to keep the mood light. I hadn't meant to say anything, but suddenly pain and anger made me ask about the torn pantyhose. I felt these emotions controlling me. I wanted to see how far I could push my wife. I thought maybe someone caused them to tear, I said, watching her closely. She did well to hide her feelings, only stiffening a bit. What brought that up? She asked, curious. I tried to keep my face blank, not letting my hurt and anger show. I shrugged. It can happen, I replied. You remember Katie, the girl I had to let go last year after some trouble at work? She often came back from breaks without her stockings. This was before I knew what was happening. I shrugged again and looked away, trying to act like I was just recalling a sad memory. Sherry bit her lip for a moment, then stepped closer. She placed her hands on my sides and gently moved them up to my chest before wrapping her arms around my neck and kissing me briefly. Honey, she said sincerely when she pulled away, you are the only man who ever had my heart. I thought you knew that. Her eyes darted as she looked for any sign of my thoughts, hoping I would believe her. I wondered how much I knew and what she would do to divert my suspicions. It hurt deeply to think she had been hiding things. I had hoped for honesty, even if I didn't know what that would look like. When you love someone, it's hard to give up without trying one last time. But Sherry was waiting for my response. I had been searching her eyes too long for something I had just lost hope in. I know that, sweetheart, I replied, trying to sound genuine. Katie's husband left her and got custody of the kids. She ruined her relationship, the other guys, and her life. All for something not worth it. My disapproval showed in my tone. Sherry flinched slightly, but her face remained unchanged. Well, she deserved it, Sherry said, and that made it clear she had her own ideas about the situation. My wife seemed to think that normal rules didn't apply to her. I released her arms from around my neck and looked at her firmly, then kissed her lips gently. I held her shoulders, turned her gently, and said, Now go get ready. I'll have dinner ready in 10 minutes. Without looking back, I walked into the kitchen. I felt lost, not knowing what to do. What was a husband supposed to do when he found out his wife had been unfaithful? For the next week and a half, I struggled to focus at work. I would start tasks and suddenly find myself staring into space, not aware of how long it had been. Some coworkers asked if I was okay, but I said I was fine. No one could help me through this. I had to solve this mystery on my own. I began to think a little more clearly. For one, the fact that the guy seemed comfortable with my wife in public meant they had been involved for a while. If it were new, he would be more cautious. This meant Sherry had been unfaithful for some time. I wondered when it had started. I couldn't recall any signs of her being unfaithful or any changes in our life together. But in the end, the duration didn't matter. What mattered was that it was happening. Secondly, I knew I couldn't accept her betrayal. I couldn't go to work each day wondering what she was doing. It wasn't in me to seek forgiveness. I didn't see the point in trying to hold on to the marriage. Sherry had broken the trust we'd built over 4 years. It seemed she had crossed boundaries multiple times, and I didn't know how we could ever rebuild that trust. The only way forward seemed to be confronting her and trying to find a way out of this situation with my dignity intact. Maybe if I had done something wrong, she would explain. I tried to push aside the troubling thoughts. I felt more alone than I had ever felt. Pain and anger washed over me, making it hard to think clearly. Accepting that my marriage was over, I started the tough process of finding a way to lessen my emotional pain. Without proof, I worried that Sherry could claim almost everything we had built together. In Texas, the courts often favored women in such cases. I pushed my feelings for Sherry to the back of my mind, focusing instead on my needs. We had some equity in our house, and our savings were finally growing. We both had good jobs and had made smart investments in our home. If I wanted to ensure my fair share of what we had, I needed to find a way to catch her being unfaithful. I looked for a chance to find out the truth. It was a Tuesday, almost 3 weeks since I first felt something was off. That day, Sherry told me she was going out with her friends for drinks and conversation, something they did every few weeks. She mentioned some friends, but I noticed her best friend, Melissa, wouldn't be there. Sherry laughed a little when she said that. Her plans seemed normal. She had done this before. Still, I felt uneasy in my heart. Even though I wanted to believe her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I needed to know what was really happening. "Connie," I said cheerfully when I called my wife's friend. Connie was someone who had joined us for meals before. "Hi there," she responded with her usual cheerfulness. "What's on your mind?" "Not much," I replied. "I was just checking to see if you and Tom are free Friday night. I was thinking about having dinner and playing some games." She teased. "I have to check my busy schedule." There was a brief pause. "No, nothing planned, sweetie," she said finally. "I'll ask Tom, but I think it sounds fun. What should we bring?" "Just yourselves and your smiles," I joked, trying to stay positive even though I felt empty inside. "Okay, dear," she replied. "I'll call you back once I know for sure, okay?" Then her tone changed slightly. "Ron, Tom and I are really happy to hear that you and Sherry are doing well. We were unsure how you two would be after the Vegas trip," she said more seriously. "Vegas?" I was surprised. At first I was curious if Connie knew more about Sherry's actions, but I couldn't understand how. The trip was one I had missed because of work commitments. Sherry had gone with Connie and their friends, and they all seemed to have returned in good spirits. But why was Connie bringing it up? I needed answers, even though it made me feel uneasy. "I'm not sure what you mean, Connie," I admitted, confusion in my voice. She paused for a moment. "Oh, it's just me being forgetful," she explained finally. "You know how I am. I'll check with Tom to see if he has plans for tomorrow, okay?" "Sure, let me know," I said. She agreed and we hung up quickly, afraid my voice would show my distress. About half an hour later, Connie called back to say Tom couldn't make it. He had to go to a neighbor's gathering. Connie felt bad about it. "Maybe next time," she suggested. I agreed but felt disappointed. Perhaps Sherry and I could try again later, but neither of us was deceiving the other. Now, I knew two things. Something had happened with Sherry in Las Vegas, and she wasn't going out with her friends that night. I had to ignore the first issue while focusing on the second. I had heard that sometimes unfaithful partners think they are clever and can fool others forever. They may start to look down on their partners because they manage to hide the truth for a while, but eventually they make mistakes because they underestimate what others can see. This was my first experience with this kind of situation, but I could see Sherry making mistakes. If I hadn't seen her with someone else at a stoplight, I might have missed her actions for longer. Being out in public with that person was a big error. It was risky. Anyone we knew could have seen her. Not making sure Connie would cover for her was another mistake. She knew I was friends with Connie and Tom, and even closer with Melissa and Cal. Whatever happened in Vegas was likely common knowledge among them. Any of them might have told me. Sherry should have done a better job hiding the truth. Her next mistake was thinking I would stay home while she was out with someone else. The last one was assuming I would accept being treated this way. I hit my fist on the coffee table, making the lamp shake. Sherry was in the shower and didn't hear anything. I rubbed my hand, feeling anger building inside as I thought about Sherry's betrayal. I worried that my anger would take over my life. My jaws felt tight, and my heart raced when I thought about Sherry. I was hiding those feelings from her, which only made it worse. It was an odd relief when I realized tonight was meant for another of their gatherings. I hated to admit it, but I felt a weight lift at the thought. Once I got through this evening, I'd take what I learned to my lawyer. I was ready to move forward with everything. Sherry left just after 7, when the sky was starting to darken. She thought I was cleaning up in the garage, but I was really just waiting for her to leave. Once she was gone, I was ready to take control of my life. Sherry didn't seem interested in what I was doing outside, nor did she want to spend time with me. She probably enjoyed having space to prepare for her night. That was okay with me. If she had come out to see me, she would have noticed the rental car I had arranged earlier. I didn't want to leave the old rental car on the street. It could get taken away. It was a small lie, keeping the rental a secret. That's the trouble with lies. They can grow and become complicated. As she left, we exchanged a few more small lies. I wished her a good time, and we said we loved each other. A couple in love wouldn't be doing what we planned for tonight. I told myself it didn't matter. When she was far enough down the block that she couldn't see the garage, I opened the door and hopped into the rental car. I drove off, pointing the remote to close the garage door while moving down our street to keep her in view. I had to slow down when I saw her waiting at a stoplight. I pulled over to stop briefly so I wouldn't get too close. Following her wasn't too hard. Like most drivers, she didn't pay much attention to the cars behind her, and even if she did, she wouldn't think to look for my old gray sedan. She had no idea her husband was just behind her. The light was still good enough for me to see her car, but it was getting darker, which was a good reason to turn on my headlights. If she looked back, she wouldn't be able to see me clearly. I stayed behind her as she drove to the southwest side of town and watched her turn into a budget motel. I quickly parked across the street and watched from my driver's side window as she sat in her car for a few minutes. She seemed restless, making quick calls on her phone. My phone didn't ring. It wasn't me she was calling. A few minutes later, a big dark blue SUV came down the street and turned into the motel. I saw a man driving, but he was moving too fast for me to see him well. He parked next to my wife's car, and they both got out and went inside together. I took a few pictures from a distance to document what was happening. My camera had a good zoom, so I could get clear images even with the light fading. My stomach twisted with anxiety and sadness as I watched them disappear inside. While I waited in my car, trying to understand everything, the feeling of betrayal was heavy. I knew I needed pictures of them leaving the room later to show how long they were inside. Time seemed to drag on, and the longer I waited, the more real it felt. I stepped out for a bit, taking a short walk to clear my head. The cool air helped calm me down a little. Eventually, I saw them leave, talking quietly as they walked back to their cars. I snapped a few more pictures to capture the time they left. I knew these photos would be important for the choices I would have to make soon. I took a deep breath and shut my eyes tight, trying to hold back the tears. I was hurting, but eventually one needs to find some peace. I pushed my feelings away, locking them up like a door I thought I had closed earlier. In that moment, thinking about her, any love I had felt far away, replaced with a distance that helped me feel strong. Suddenly, I heard loud voices from inside the room. I recognized my wife's voice but couldn't hear what she said. Then a loud shout came from a man. I had never known men to be very loud in these situations, but maybe it was possible. I didn't want to stick around, afraid someone might notice. I walked back to my rental car across the street but paused behind another vehicle to think. After a moment, I continued down the sidewalk looking for any hidden security cameras. I found an empty place where a camera could go, but no cameras were in sight. As I crossed the parking lot, I noticed the empty restaurant nearby. It seemed unlikely there would be any cameras around there. The nearby apartment buildings were too far away to matter. On the main street, it looked pretty secure without visible businesses or cameras. I made sure my camera was stored safely in the back seat before going back to the parking area where my wife and the man had just been. I took out my pocket knife and thought about my next step. After a moment, I crouched down near the SUV's tires. It took more effort than I thought, but I managed to puncture the first tire. The hissing sound was loud but also satisfying, and no one came to check it out. Encouraged, I went on to puncture all 4 tires. Though it was a childish act, it was my way of getting back at them. I doubted they would realize I was there. After all, they seemed too sure of themselves to think there was a problem. I felt a rush of excitement but stopped myself from going any further. Years ago, dealing with infidelity might have been different, but things had changed. The choices for someone betrayed were fewer now. I was determined to take action that would help me feel a bit of my self-respect back. Feeling slightly relieved, I walked back to my rental car, closing the door with a bit more force, not concerned about who might hear. I had begun to take steps to regain my self-respect and planned to talk to my lawyer on Monday. Saturday night turned into Sunday, and Sherry came home sooner than I expected. She looked upset because her tires had been damaged outside the club. She told me she saw 3 teenagers running away and had to wait a long time for help. Thankfully, no one connected her tire problems with me, and I felt a strange mix of indifference and relief. I thought she would be out longer with her new friend, so her early return suggested that things didn't work out, but it didn't really bother me. I said some comforting words to her before she went to bed, and she fell asleep quickly without seeking any comfort from me. The smell of her perfume reminded me of where she had been. Throughout Sunday, she was unexpectedly warm and wanted me close. It was surprising how relaxed and happy she seemed, with no signs of guilt. From what I had read, this behavior often happens when someone is unfaithful. They try to make up for what they've done. Earlier that day, I had talked to my lawyer, who was ready for our meeting. The photos I took would help if Sherry contested the divorce. Tomorrow afternoon, I would begin my journey to freedom, at least somewhat. The divorce wouldn't be final for 6 months, but I would be apart from the woman who had caused me so much hurt. That night, Sherry came to me in a nightgown I liked. I felt her intent, but I was conflicted about how to respond. The thought of being close to her again made me uneasy. I sat on the bed, trying to create some emotional space. She was trying hard to connect with me, acting like a devoted partner. Despite my hesitation, I felt some emotions stirring inside me, which only added to my frustration. Then, without thinking it through, I changed my mind. I decided to give my wife the connection she was looking for just one last time before we parted ways. It was a blend of unresolved feelings and a wish to regain some dignity amid my pain. I stood up and pulled her closer for a brief kiss. It started off soft, just a gentle touch of lips. Then we kissed again, this time with more feeling as I sought some closure in our past. I let my hands move to her arms, creating a familiar feeling between us. She leaned into me, her soft reactions urging me to keep going. For a moment, I let myself sink into the comfort of those familiar feelings. As we continued, I was gentle and paid attention to her responses. I wanted our interaction to feel warm and understanding without bringing up the hurt from before. In the end, it wasn't about bringing back what we had lost, but about finding a way to say goodbye. That night didn't change anything. The divorce still loomed, and I would soon be separated from the woman who had caused me so much distress. Later, Sherry approached me again, trying to make a connection. I felt uncomfortable and sat on the bed to keep some distance. She was clearly trying to reach out, but I was torn inside. I thought about giving in for one last moment before we separated, but I quickly reminded myself of the hurt and betrayal I felt. I decided I needed to stay firm and not give in. This moment wasn't about rekindling anything, but about closing this chapter of our lives. I stood up and gently made it clear that I wasn't ready for more. Sherry seemed to understand, even though I could see sadness in her eyes. We both knew this was the start of the end. Though it was painful, it was something we had to face. Ultimately, it was about finding closure and moving on, despite everything that had happened. Sherry and I had shared so much, but the end was approaching. That night, as she tried to connect with me one last time, I felt many emotions swirl inside me. Yet I knew what needed to be done. I kept my distance and focused on the reality of our situation, understanding this was not a time to heal, but a time to find closure. Later, after we settled down, I moved away, allowing her to rest. I took a long, warm shower to help clear my thoughts. After that, I quietly left the room and decided to sleep in the guest room instead. The next morning, I woke up early and left the house before she was awake. I knew the day ahead wouldn't be easy, but I looked forward to finally moving past the pain I had been feeling. I understood she might be upset about my sudden absence, but I didn't want to be near her. It was too hard for me. About 3 hours after she left, I returned to the house with a moving truck. I had already dropped off some important items at my lawyer's office, and his assistant printed out 2 copies of everything I needed. I noticed her sympathy when she returned them to me, but I didn't want pity. Back home, I settled in with a few cups of coffee and started packing my clothes and the few things I had brought into the marriage. I realized I didn't want much of the furniture we had purchased together. I only wanted a DVD player, a small TV, and a few music CDs. Nothing else really seemed important. I backed up my computer files, took the hard drive, and put it in my briefcase, planning to buy another computer later. Before I left, I placed a dozen photos I had taken last Friday night on top of her dresser. I used the computer one last time to print out a message in big letters. "Enjoy the memories of last night, dear. They're the last you'll have of me." Looking back, I realized this was a childish thing to do, and it didn't feel good in the morning light. But I had worked hard to get to this point, and I wouldn't go back. I taped the message to the mirror, turned, and left what had been our bedroom, going down the hall and out the garage door. I didn't lock the door. It was no longer my concern. I thought that once the divorce papers were served, our attorneys would discuss how to divide our belongings, and it would be done. However, The process took longer than I expected, with my lawyer and hers spending hours on small details. One time, they even spent an entire lunch discussing whether I should return the TV I had taken, or if it was part of my share of the house's electronics. The whole thing seemed to drag on. In the end, it was decided that the house and its furniture would be sold and the money would be split equally after the lawyers took their fees. We would pick out a few items each, but only up to a total value of $5,000. I didn't care about the furniture anymore. I just told my lawyer to get on with it. A few weeks after filing for divorce, but before our first court date, I visited Cal and Melissa's house. I thought they might know more about how everything had started. Melissa had been Sherry's best friend in college, and we had all become close over the years. I noticed they hadn't visited us since the trip to Vegas, and I wanted to find out why. When I got there, Cal was in the backyard. He handed me a cold drink and invited me to sit in the shade of a large tree. We sat in silence for a moment. "So?" I began, but Melissa suddenly got up and went inside. Cal and I exchanged concerned looks. "She gets emotional sometimes," Cal said quietly. "I understand," I replied, forcing a smile among the sadness we were all feeling. I took a sip of my drink. "Ron," Cal finally said, "we're really sorry that things between you and Sherry didn't work out, but we didn't know how to help you." I looked at him, searching for answers. I could see realization dawning on his face. "You don't know what happened," he said. I shook my head. He went to get us both more drinks. "We weren't sure whether to tell you what happened after Vegas," he said sadly. "We thought Sherry would talk to you about it, but it seemed like she didn't." "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Cal took a deep breath and spent the next while explaining how Sherry felt during that trip. She was upset because I had to cancel at the last minute and had told the others that if I wasn't there when she needed me, she would find someone else. That night was difficult for her, and it seemed like no one fully understood. Later, Melissa and Connie went to check on Sherry and found her looking unwell. It turned out a man had been around, but he didn't seem to care about Sherry's feelings. It was a complicated situation that I now began to understand. He eventually left, but since Sherry didn't come with Melissa, Cal, and Tom that Saturday evening, they wondered if she had met up with the unknown man again. Besides that one meeting on Saturday afternoon, none of the four saw Sherry until late Sunday afternoon when she arrived at the airport for her flight home. They didn't see how she got to the terminal, so they couldn't say if her boyfriend had brought her. They really didn't care, and I understood that. Melissa came back outside with red eyes and stood behind my chair, resting her hands on my shoulders. Every so often, she would pat me gently like a friend trying to offer comfort. I appreciated it more than I realized at the moment. When Cal was done talking, I found myself staring off into space. "I wish you had told me," I said after a while. "I don't know if it would have changed anything, but maybe some of the dishonesty could have been avoided." I sighed, holding back tears. But what's done is done. It wouldn't have made a difference in the end. "How did you find out about Vegas?" Melissa asked softly. I leaned back to look at her. "You all just mentioned it," I said. She looked puzzled. "Well, how did you find out?" she asked again. I took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I saw them in Sherry's car a few weeks ago, and I knew something was off," I said quietly. Both their faces showed concern. "Oh, you poor man," Melissa said. "What a rough way to learn the truth." I shrugged. "I don't think there's a good way, Melissa," I said. "But it's over now." I looked down at the grass to hide my eyes, feeling tears come. Sherry had come by a few days ago to tell them about the divorce. Melissa mentioned that Sherry was upset she wouldn't back her up. Sherry thought it was a terrible mistake. When Melissa shared her disappointment, Sherry had left angrily. That was just like her, blaming everyone except those directly involved. Cal, Melissa, and I chatted for another hour before I decided to leave. Their young child needed attention, and I didn't want to be a bother during dinner, even though they insisted I stay. After 3.5 months of discussions, the topic of some pictures I had taken of Sherry and the man came up. Sherry was anxious I might share them online. I suggested it might help speed things along, even joking about sending copies to her friends. I didn't mean to go through with it, but hoped it would help us come to an agreement. There could have been legal issues if I acted on my words. Taking pictures through a window had privacy concerns. I told my attorney I would risk a lawsuit if we didn't reach an agreement soon. The next day, Sherry's lawyer raised the matter of selling the house, offering me 60% of the sale price if I gave up all copies of the pictures. But I declined. Later, they offered me 55% if I kept just one copy and wouldn't share it online. Sherry also asked for a private meeting. I countered with 60%, one copy of the pictures, no digital copies, and a maximum of 30 minutes with her. In the end, we agreed on 60% of the house, 2 copies of the pictures, 1 for each of us, no digital copies, and a 1-hour private meeting. They dropped all motions in court, and we moved forward with an uncontested divorce as quickly as possible. The court recognized that Sherry and I were no longer living together while waiting for the final divorce papers. Texas doesn't have legal separations, so this was the closest we could get. I was fine with it. We could sell the home and its contents without delaying the divorce process, which would be resolved in another 2 months. Meanwhile, I focused on my job to keep the divorce from affecting my work. I arrived at the office early and left late. Noticing my hard work, my boss made me the acting director of the R&D department. He gave me many problems to solve, though there was no pay raise. I didn't mind much. I just wanted to keep my personal troubles out of my work life. I got to the meeting with Sherry about 10 minutes early. I secretly hoped the traffic would be bad enough to delay me, but it wasn't. The meeting would take place in an empty office in my attorney's suite. I was shown into the office and sat behind a big desk. My lawyer said it would create a bit of a psychological advantage, putting Sherry at a disadvantage. One of my lawyer's assistants, who had been kind during the divorce process, fussed over me for a moment, straightening my tie and brushing off non-existent dust. As I sat there, she leaned in close. I could smell her perfume, and when everyone else left the room to greet Sherry, she lightly touched my shoulder, encouraging me with a squeeze of my hand. She stood up, turned, and looked back with a smile before leaving. Once everyone was gone, I got up and moved to a seat at the small table in front of the big desk. I didn't feel the need for any barriers. My wife had been unfaithful, and I was ready to talk to her about it. I didn't think things were more complicated than that. When Sherry walked in, she saw me calmly sorting through photographs of her and someone else in a difficult situation. I was trying to place them neatly on the table, but they kept sliding around. It took a lot of effort to get them to line up. When I looked up, I noticed her cheeks were flushed. She was an appealing woman, not the typical kind of beautiful, but there was something I had loved for over 6 years. However, I couldn't recognize the person she had become. "You got me good, didn't you?" she said bitterly, interrupting my thoughts. Her face showed irritation, something I had grown to expect from her lately. "I bet you're proud of yourself." I adjusted the photos with my fingernail and shrugged. "No," I said quietly. "You got yourself," I replied. I could see her glaring at me, and I braced myself for a sharp response. I decided to speak first. "I'm definitely not proud of finding out about your unfaithfulness. I thought you would never betray my trust. Why would you think I'd feel any other way?" She seemed taken aback for a moment, looking confused. I intentionally checked my watch. "I heard you wanted to talk to me. So go ahead. We have about 55 minutes left." I leaned back in my chair, feeling tired of the photos. Sherry tried not to look at them and focused on me instead. She took a deep breath. "Ron, Whoa, hold on," I said quickly. She paused, surprised by my sudden intensity. "You can't call me terms of endearment anymore," I told her. "You lost that right when you chose to be unfaithful." She flinched, unable to look me in the eye, focusing instead on the wall behind me. "I didn't mean to cross any lines," she finally said. "Okay," I replied, "just so we're on the same page." She nodded. "Ron," she hesitated, glancing at me. "Ron," she continued, "first I want to say I'm sorry for everything. I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe that." "I don't have to believe anything," I shot back. "What makes you think you could betray me without hurting me?" She stared at me for a long moment. "I never wanted you to find out," she said softly. "If you hadn't known, you wouldn't have been hurt." I scoffed. "What? No harm? No foul? Sherry, you either underestimate me or you're mistaken. From what I've heard, you were seeing this guy and no one could find you until the next afternoon. You didn't even try to hide it. How could you think I wouldn't eventually find out?" She sat in silence for a moment. "Then why didn't you stop me?" she asked sharply. "What?" I said. "I wasn't there." She shook her head. When we got back, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you stop me from seeing him again? She was getting emotional. Why didn't you fight for me? You're supposed to love me, she exclaimed. This was confusing enough without her speaking in circles. Sherry, I said wearily, how could I have known what you were doing? Then I realized something. Oh, Sherry, our friends didn't tell me about Vegas until I had already found out. She flinched at my bluntness. Do you want to know how I discovered it? I asked. She nodded, a small tear forming in her eye. I saw you while I was sitting in a van at a stoplight, I said simply. Her expression went from defiance to despair. I waited for her response. I'm so sorry you saw that, Ron, she finally said. I'm sorry for letting it happen. You didn't seem upset then, I replied. In fact, you looked like you were having fun, I said. She cringed in her seat, but then straightened up. I came here to be honest with you, and I will be, she said. I was enjoying it, she continued. I was. But it was nothing more than a mistake, Ron. But it wasn't just that, Sherry, I said gently. It was with someone else. And that wasn't right. I slammed my hand down on the clean tabletop, the sound echoing in the quiet room. I had a commitment to you, Sherry, I said. It's called a marriage. No one else should have been involved. I leaned back, shaking with anger. I worked to keep my temper in check. The 24 pictures on the table spread across the surface. To keep my hands busy, I started stacking them up again. I'm sorry, Ron, she said after a while. You're right. I should never have done anything with that man. I understand that. I don't have any excuses. For the first time today, I agree with you, I said, cutting off whatever she was going to say. Yeah, she said, I know. She took a deep breath. Ron, would it make any difference if I told you that the night you took these pictures, I told him I was done seeing him? I looked up from my stack of photos. She held my gaze. I shrugged. No, not really, I said evenly. She seemed surprised. She thought she had something important to add. Sherry, you made a choice, and it hurt me deeply. When you came home, you didn't tell me, and it kept going here in our town. You didn't stop when you returned. What's the saying? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. That certainly didn't apply to you, did it? You kept going. You know what, Sherry? I've been told that crossing boundaries can become easier over time. Apparently it does. You had no trouble finding ways to betray our commitment. I doubt you would have stopped if I hadn't found those pictures and asked for a divorce. I looked up at her. You told me you weren't going to see him anymore, but honestly, I'm having a hard time believing that, I said. It feels like I can't trust what you're saying. It's true, she replied with frustration. Right after we went into the room, I told him it would be our last time. I felt guilty and wanted to make a change. She picked up one of the pictures and held it up for me to see. Look at this, she insisted. He was upset because I said I wasn't going to be with him anymore. Not long after this was taken, I left. I shook my head. I didn't want to see what she was showing me, and it didn't really matter. It seems to me you were okay with things that shouldn't have happened, I said, raising my hand to stop her from responding. But let's say you're being honest. I leaned on the table. If you really wanted to stop seeing him, why didn't you just tell him? Why did it have to be a last meeting? She looked down, ashamed. I know, it was wrong, but... Stop, Sherry, I don't want to hear excuses. Even if I believed you, I can't shake the feeling that your secret life was bigger than your regrets. You might have meant what you said for a moment, but I don't believe you could have truly walked away without coming clean with me first. Sooner or later, you would have wanted comfort outside of our relationship, right? Isn't that part of the issue? I felt the frustration rising again. I took a breath and tried to calm down. Sherry was crying once more. You don't have to speak to me like that, she whispered. I'm your wife. I looked away, feeling let down. Not for much longer, I replied carefully. We're separated. The courts have recognized it, and soon it will be official. Besides, I speak differently to those who break trust than I do to those who keep it. Ron, I'm trying to show how sorry I am for what I did. Can't you see that? I'm truly sorry. I shook my head. The weight of it all was heavy. Okay, Sherry, you're sorry. I'm sorry too. Almost everyone in this position feels regret. So what does that change? We sat in silence for a moment. Sherry, I said slowly. You've affected me deeply. I pointed to my chest. There's a big emptiness in me where I used to hold the trust of someone I loved, someone I could talk to when things were tough. You were my friend, someone I could share anything with, my partner, the one I imagined spending my life with. You took that away, and I can't get it back, I told her, my voice cracking. Sherry was crying even harder. Ron! I interrupted her. Sherry, I said carefully, you've caused me a lot of pain, hurting me, yourself, and our marriage. I took a deep breath. I hope whatever you gained from this was worth it, because I heard this morning that the other person involved is also facing problems. That was true. An investigator for my attorney found out about a situation at a motel, and I learned that the other person's spouse was angry and filing for divorce, too. There had been other issues at that motel, but I knew they weren't connected to us. I watched my wife cry, feeling distant from her now. Will you tell me why you did it? I asked. It took her a while to calm down. I wanted to know if she had anything to add about her time in Las Vegas. I don't know, Ron, she said, a bit bitter. It felt so different out there. Nothing felt real when I got there. I was upset you weren't with me. Then, he was nice to me, showing understanding for my loneliness. Eventually, I just went along with it. She struggled to explain, and for the first time I felt some anger. Well, that's just... I said, trying to find the right words. I couldn't. There's no excuse for what you did, I finally said, losing my temper a bit. I had to go to Denver for work. If I hadn't gone, I could have lost my job, and we wouldn't have been able to afford our home. I couldn't be with you in Las Vegas. Don't you think I would have been if I could have? Being under the influence is not an excuse. You're an adult. Did you really think it was okay to drink when you knew it could cloud your judgment? Just because you're in a different place doesn't mean you can make decisions that hurt others. You're attractive, Sherry. Of course, people will notice you. But that doesn't mean you should look for comfort from someone else when you're married. Talking about kindness, yes, he likely took advantage of the moment. But you were still married and had to uphold that commitment. The first time you let yourself get too close to him, just like breaking a vow, you went against everything we promised each other. Do you think I'm unattractive? I meet different women when I travel, but I stay faithful. Every time I go on a business trip, someone seems interested in me, but I never act on those feelings. This past year, a few women have shown interest, but I didn't think much of it because I have a wonderful partner waiting for me at home. I guess I was mistaken, I said bitterly. If only I had known. Sherry sat across from me, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back tears. The room was quiet except for her soft sobs. I wasn't clear on why she wanted to talk, but I found myself doing most of the talking. You should never have let him get close at all, Sherry, I said, unable to shake the feeling that was bothering me inside. Once you let him in, it became a path you could never return from. Every step after that only made it worse. Suddenly, my anger faded. I slumped down in my chair, trying to breathe slowly. I don't know what else to say, Sherry, I finally admitted. It feels like you've ruined something truly special. All I have left is pain, and it just won't go away. I loved you completely. In fact, I still love you. It's not so easy for me to turn my feelings on and off like you seem to. Ron, Sherry said hesitantly, if you still love me, maybe we could start over. She paused when she saw me shake my head. But you were so kind that Sunday before you left, she said, confused and hurt. Not really, I replied sharply. I wasn't being kind. I just wanted to make sure you'd remember that day when I wasn't there. It was a cruel thing to do, and I regret it now. It was childish and pointless. Sherry's face turned to shock and then disappointment. She had hoped I wanted to reconcile. We sat there looking at one another for a while. Oh, and no, I can't start over, I said, recalling her question. I don't have anything left to begin again with, Sherry, I admitted. I can't trust you anymore. And I can't imagine ever trusting you again. I just can't live like that. I sighed and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. I don't know what I did to deserve this, Sherry, I said softly. I thought I was enough for you. Clearly, I was wrong. You did nothing wrong, Ron, Sherry said quickly. It was all me. I made a terrible choice, and I'm so sorry. I wish I could change everything, but I can't. I can't help but wonder, Sherry, I said quietly. When did you think this was okay? How did you convince yourself this was right? I never meant for this to happen, Ron, she replied in a broken voice. It just occurred. I wasn't looking for it. That was it. I had heard enough. I straightened up and started to put away the photos, stacking them neatly. I was done with the excuses. No, it didn't just occur, I said firmly. You let it happen, Sherry. You made choices, and now we are here because of them. She looked at me with tears still in her eyes as I stood up, ready to leave the past behind. You did it and you kept it going. Period, I said, and she just stared at me, seemingly in shock. And it wasn't a mistake either, I added. A mistake is when you accidentally grab the wrong item at the store. This is more like a complete mess. And I guess that's just how it has to be, Sherry, I told her. I can't be with someone I can't trust. I wouldn't lock you away if I could. If I have to worry whenever I leave your side that you might be with someone else. Well, I'd rather just walk away. I'll let you do what makes you happy. I placed the photos in my jacket pocket and stood up. I don't have anything else to say, Sherry, and our time is almost up. Do you want to tell me anything? She stood and looked me in the eye across the table. Just one thing, Ron, and then you can go if you want. I thought I could explain what happened and see if we could work through this. I pulled one of the photos from my pocket. I held it up for her to see. Sherry, I don't need an explanation. This photo shows me everything I need to know. If it didn't, what Cal and Melissa told me would have revealed the truth sooner or later. I don't understand your point of view. Don't you see? When you went to your room in Las Vegas and shut the door, you shut me out of your life. That single act ended our marriage. Everything else is just more confusion on top of that. There's no way to explain it away. The facts are what they are. I don't know what more I can say. How about if I say there's no explanation that will change anything? Does that make it clearer? She seemed to gather what little strength she had left, but she ignored what I had just said. Ron, I love you and will always love you. I want you to remember that, she said. I've been selfish. I've messed things up, but I won't ever stop loving you. Can you understand that, Ron? I nodded and shrugged. I had no doubt she believed she was sincere at that moment, but it felt like a one-dimensional love if it was flexible enough to allow her to do what she'd done. I adjusted my jacket and turned away from the woman who had been my wife. Ron, I'm sorry. Yeah, I know, I replied, not looking at her. I remained silent, and so did she. Sherry didn't reach for me as I walked out the door. I felt relieved, because I knew that deep down I still loved her as much as when we got married, even though I couldn't forget how she had let me down. Our marriage was broken, and it was time to move on. I closed the door quietly behind me, leaving the past behind. Just 2 days after talking with Sherry, I understood why I wasn't made the permanent director of research and development. I was offered a choice between that job or a deputy assistant director position at our parent company in Denver. This new role would involve a lot of travel, sometimes for months at a time. I accepted quickly. Getting away felt really important to me. I would continue working until my replacement arrived from St. Louis and learned the job. Meanwhile, the company planned to bring in people from different locations to help me understand my new role. There would be meetings, video calls, and presentations to make sure I was ready. The pay increase was significant, but it didn't bring me as much joy as I had hoped. I had no one to share the news with, except for a few close friends. I called Melissa and Cal shortly after leaving my boss's office. Melissa was excited about my new position and let me know how happy she was. I could tell she was sad about my move, though. We made plans to have dinner on Friday, and it was nice, but it felt different. 2 weeks later, the first person set to brief me arrived. Miss Webster was a buyer for some of our other businesses. Although I wouldn't be her boss in Denver, she had important information about our parent company. She stopped in Texas on her way back from a trip to the Carolinas. Even though it was Friday afternoon, we needed to meet. Miss Webster looked to be in her 30s. She wore a sharp, dark gray suit and seemed very serious when we first met. She shook my hand quickly and walked next to me with long strides, despite being a bit shorter. We headed to a conference room with equipment for presentations. Once there, she decided to use her laptop instead of the fancy tech in the other room. Located at a corner of the table, we began discussing her division's operations. I think I surprised her with some questions. She made notes when I asked about things she didn't know, promising to find the answers later. The meeting was effective, and I felt I understood her division's role in the larger company. Afterwards, we walked out to a nearly empty office space filled with cubicles. We both checked our watches and realized how much time had passed. "I'm sorry, Miss Webster," I said, feeling guilty. "I didn't realize how long we were in there." I smiled. "I guess I should thank you for being such an informative briefer." For the first time, she smiled brightly. Her serious expression changed, and I liked it. "Karen," she said. Confused, I looked around and saw only a few men waiting by the elevators. "No, I'm Karen," she clarified, beaming. I felt a little embarrassed. "Oh," I replied, "I apologize for that. I should have been paying more attention. And I'll say it was the hour that got me distracted by such a knowledgeable colleague," she added, making me feel better with her kind words. "Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it," I said, feeling a bit awkward. "No problem," she replied, her hand falling back to her side. I felt a warm connection in that brief moment. "I really meant it," she said, smiling again. "Anyway, thanks," I said. Can I drive you to your hotel or airport?" I should have asked sooner. "Well, I haven't checked into a hotel yet," she said lightly. "I came straight from the airport." I felt a bit concerned. "Then I can at least take you to where you're staying," I offered. "Do you have a reservation?" She nodded and told me where she planned to go. "Let me lock my office and I'll drive you there. Does that sound good?" She nodded again, giving me that wonderful smile. It made me feel warm, even in the cool air conditioning common in South Texas offices. It turned out Karen hadn't even picked up her bags, so we made a quick stop at the airport. Eventually, we found her 2 suitcases, which had been set aside because she hadn't collected them right away. The woman who helped us seemed a bit annoyed, as if there was an unspoken rule that travelers should grab their luggage as soon as they arrive. Karen and I exchanged friendly words with the employee, managing to brighten her mood before we left. Once we were away, Karen and I shared a laugh about how well we had turned the situation around. After reclaiming my car from the parking lot, I drove Karen to one of the nicer hotels downtown and walked her to the front desk. Her reservation was confirmed and her room was ready. I didn't need to stay, but I had helped with her bags. After finishing the paperwork, and when she was ready to head up, I stood there wondering whether to leave or stay. Karen, if I'm overstepping, just let me know, but I'd like that," she said, surprising me with her directness. "Just dinner? Or—" I looked at her blankly at first. It had been a while since I asked someone to join me for a meal. "Well, how about dinner? And then I know a place where we can go for a quiet drink and maybe some dancing if you're up for it. How does that sound?" She stepped a little closer and smiled. "Pick me up at 8?" she asked, stepping back. "I'll be here," I agreed. She smiled warmly and turned to lead the bellboy to the elevators. I felt a spark of excitement about the evening ahead. I walked past my car and had to backtrack half a block to find it. I couldn't get a table at the restaurant I had hoped to take Karen to, so we settled for what used to be called Fisher's Dining and Dancing. The name had been shortened over time to just Fisher's. It was a dinner club with excellent food that served until 10 p.m. After that, they opened up a wall to reveal more tables and a large dance floor, turning it into one of the best nightclubs in town until 2 a.m. Diners could finish their meals and stay at their table during the club hours if they wanted, although reaching the dance floor required moving through several tables, which some found inconvenient. Others preferred sitting close to the wooden dance floor. It was a nice place for people in their 30s. I used to go there often with my wife when we were together. When I arrived at her hotel, I called up and Karen came down to the lobby. My jaw dropped when the elevator door opened, and I surely stared for a moment as she walked across the lobby toward me. She wore a lovely seafoam green dress, which made a strong impression. Her hair hung softly just above her shoulders. When she stepped up to me, her heels brought her face level with mine. She had beautiful eyes. "You look amazing," was all I could manage to say. It was sincere, though maybe not very articulate. I felt a bit shy, but perhaps that was okay. She blushed slightly, but accepted the compliment, and took my arm in a friendly way. "Shall we go?" she asked. "I'm just amazed by you," I said, managing a smile. She smiled back with warmth. "But I'm hungry," she said. I nodded, glancing back at her and still feeling enchanted. "Then shall we go, madame?" I gestured toward the sliding glass doors leading outside. She nodded, and we walked out arm in arm, the moment feeling special. "This is a lovely place," Karen said quietly, leaning closer to me. She looked around, smiling at people and soaking in the atmosphere. I noticed others were looking at her too. Though I wasn't a regular, a few familiar faces in the crowd were curious about who this attractive young woman was. I understood their interest. She was extraordinary. "It really is," I agreed. After a moment, I decided to share what was on my mind. "You're probably getting looks because I used to bring my wife here sometimes," I mentioned, trying to sound casual. She glanced at me, then moved closer where my wedding ring used to be. "So, what's going on with you?" she asked. "That's what's left of what I thought was a good marriage," I said slowly. "Just a couple more weeks and I'll have the final papers," I told her. "We've been separated for a while, just waiting for the required time to pass." "What happened?" Karen asked in a steady voice. She looked directly at me, showing curiosity without judgment. I gave her a short version. "We had been drifting apart for about a year. Not really sure why. She has her career and I'm starting one I didn't anticipate. Maybe we were just growing apart without realizing it. Well, anyway, she went to Vegas with friends and I couldn't go due to work issues. She was upset with me, had a few drinks, and ended up with someone else. That's when everything changed," I explained. "A one-time thing?" Karen asked. I shook my head. "No, she spent the whole weekend with him. Later I learned she kept seeing him for about a month and a half before I saw them together." "I see," Karen replied. I noticed a flash of understanding in her expression. "I just couldn't forgive that. I'm sorry. Cheating isn't something I can accept, and things just got worse from there," I admitted. She nodded, sighing softly. She moved a little closer, placing her hand on my wrist and lowering her voice. We talked about many things that evening, starting with my past and moving on to different topics as the night went on. I learned that she was 31, a bit older than me, and we joked about her being the older woman. She had been divorced for over 10 years, which helped her understand what I was going through. She worked as a waitress while studying for a business degree at night, and later became a manager in charge of a team. We found out we had a lot in common, like our love for Tom Clancy books, music from the 60s and 70s, and realistic paintings. I told her I wasn't a great dancer, but I liked being on the dance floor with her. I was careful not to step on her toes and told her she looked lovely in her outfit. It made her look graceful. She said our meeting wasn't just about business, and I agreed. When she went to the restroom, I admired how elegantly she walked. Later, Melissa told me she had seen Karen in the bathroom, where Karen mentioned something exciting happening soon. They shared some friendly words, and it sounded like they enjoyed the conversation. When Karen came back, she was cheerful and made our time enjoyable. As we left, I saw Melissa and Cal, and we had a short chat before saying goodbye. I noticed that Cal seemed a bit nervous, but I didn't think much of it at the time. In the car, Karen sat close to me. We shared a sweet kiss that grew warmer. We talked softly, and I felt calm knowing things were good at home. Our evening kept getting better, with a sense of connection that felt right. We broke apart, both smiling like we were sharing a fun secret. "We have a room," she said softly. "We have an apartment," I replied, "but the room is closer." "Drive fast?" she giggled. I smiled back and started the car. Soon we were on our way. During the drive, we chatted about different things, and I really enjoyed being with her. After we arrived at the hotel, Karen locked the door and turned to me with a happy smile. We shared a moment of understanding, and she said she was excited to spend more time with me. With confidence, she moved closer as we continued our conversation, talking about our favorite books, music, and art. Our bond deepened as we shared our experiences. As the evening ended, we made our way to the door, saying our goodbyes and planning to meet again. I valued the time we spent together and was excited to see where this connection might lead. As we were together, we felt a strong sense of understanding and connection. Karen told me about her life, and I found myself really listening. We enjoyed every moment, laughing and discussing our thoughts. We supported each other and enjoyed the laughter and meaningful conversations. Our connection grew as we explored our shared interests and feelings. Karen thanked me for our time, and I felt lucky to have such a genuine bond. When it was time for us to go, we did so with anticipation for our next meeting. We promised to stay in touch and looked forward to creating more memories together. Our time was meaningful and filled with connection. We were truly engaged with each other, sharing heartfelt moments. As our connection deepened, we paid close attention to what each other needed, offering kind support and comfort. Eventually, we took time to relax together. We shared a warm hug, enjoying the closeness and the feelings of friendship that had grown between us. Later, we kept exploring what we both loved, enjoying our time side by side. Each moment was filled with warmth, and we cherished our time together. By the end of our evening, we felt fulfilled and connected. We parted with promises to stay in touch and nurture the bond we'd built. When it was time for Karen to leave, we said our goodbyes, looking forward to reconnecting soon. Our time had been meaningful, and we were excited about seeing each other again. Our shared experiences were exciting and memorable, especially the times we connected deeply. For a while, we traveled a lot, but my move to Denver made things easier. We met every couple of weeks for a year and a half and took 2 vacations together, one in Vail and the other in the Bahamas. I finally finished my flying lessons and got my certificate. I bought a small Cessna plane which cost more to maintain than a plane ticket, but it allowed me to fly when I wanted. I often smiled when I remembered the time I took Karen flying and we shared a special moment way up in the sky. Hey listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.